On a quiet morning in Crestwood, Colorado, a routine traffic stop turned into something no one could have imagined. Is this some kind of joke? Officer Rachel Monroe sneered as she stepped out of her patrol car, eyeing the elderly man on the rumbling 1970 Harley. That man, Walter Grant, 82 years old, sat still, hands steady on the handlebars, eyes calm as if he had seen far worse than flashing blue lights. What the young officer didn't know was that within minutes, 12 military Humvees would thunder down that road, carrying 50 soldiers and one furious captain, all there for him. Walter had spent the last 4 decades waking before dawn, tending his land, fixing machines by hand, and riding that old Harley like it was part of his soul. To strangers, he appeared to be just another frail senior clinging to his youth. But behind those quiet eyes was a decorated war hero who had trained generations of soldiers and carried scars from Vietnam, the Gulf, and Afghanistan. The officers mocked him, searched him without cause, and questioned his sanity. But across the street, Miles Carter, a Gulf War vet and gas station owner, recognized Walter instantly. One call to Fort Rainier changed everything. What followed was a public reckoning. Captain Elijah Brooks stepping out of a Humvee to salute Colonel Walter Grant, silencing the crowd. This wasn't just a story about military honor. It was a powerful reminder: never judge by appearances. You have no idea what battles someone has fought, or still fights silently every day. Officer Rachel Monroe saw an old man on a rusty Harley. That's all she saw, nothing more. She didn't see the decades of discipline stitched into the way he held the handlebars. She didn't notice how still he sat. Not out of confusion, but out of unwavering control. She didn't recognize that the man she mocked had once stared down death more times than she had traffic stops. Because when you wear age and rust on the outside, the world assumes there's nothing sharp left on the inside. Walter Grant, 82, had lived through storms most people only read about. 3 tours in Vietnam, intel missions across the Middle East. He had survived ambushes, led soldiers through desert nights, and brought home men who thought they'd never see their families again. But now, he was just another old man on a beat-up bike, being questioned like a criminal for the crime of aging with dignity. What stung wasn't the firm command to get off the bike, or the sneer about whether he was too old to ride. No, what cut deepest was the presumption that his silence was ignorance, that his calm was confusion. Officer Monroe and her partner, Officer Dave Ramirez, didn't realize they weren't confronting weakness. They were staring at restraint, shaped by a lifetime of service. Walter had seen humiliation before, in war zones where enemies stripped prisoners of their names, their uniforms, their humanity. But this was different. This was home. And here, in the country he had risked everything for, he was being sized up by a younger generation who had no idea what sacrifices bought their freedom. Across the street, Miles Carter, the Gulf War vet who owned the gas station, wiped grease from his hands and felt fury rising in his chest. He'd known Walter for 15 years. Quiet, reliable, never missed a payment, never asked for anything. But Miles remembered something else too. A photo in a military publication from decades ago. The name wasn't just Walter. It was Colonel Walter Grant, one of the most respected strategic trainers the Army had ever known. As the officers continued their condescending questions, "Do you live alone? Does anyone take care of you?" Walter said little. Not because he couldn't, but because he had learned long ago. Patience is a stronger weapon than pride. His silence was not surrender. It was grace under fire. But make no mistake, he noticed everything. The hand on the holstered weapon. The doubt in their voices. The crowd gathering. The subtle turn from protocol to public shaming. And in his stillness, he weighed whether the past 60 years of loyalty and sacrifice had all been forgotten. When he finally spoke, calm, deliberate, without raising his voice, it wasn't to defend himself. It was to ask a simple question. For what crime? Officer? That moment shifted something. Not in Monroe or Ramirez, at least not yet, but in those watching. In the bystanders. In the veterans who recognized the silence of experience. In the teenagers filming, who sensed that the man on the bike was not who they first assumed. The truth is, Walter's silence was the most powerful part of the scene. Not because it was passive, but because it was principled. He had survived wars without ever shouting. He had led men through hell with nothing but steady eyes and unwavering command. And on that sidewalk, surrounded by doubt, he chose not to escalate, but to endure. What they didn't see was the fire beneath that stillness. But they would, because down the road, 50 soldiers were already on their way, led by a captain who knew exactly who Walter Grant was, and who would make sure the whole town remembered. In a world quick to judge and slow to listen, Walter's story reminds us, the quietest man in the room is often the one who's seen the most. For nearly 20 minutes, Colonel Walter Grant stood in silence, unarmed, unmoved, and unshaken, while 2 young officers circled him like he was some lost relic on the side of the road. Officer Rachel Monroe's voice had risen in frustration. Her tone sharper now, louder, desperate to assert control she hadn't truly earned. Sir, you're going to the station. You may need a psychological evaluation. You're not well enough to be on the road. But Walter didn't flinch. He had been called worse by men far more dangerous in jungles far more merciless. His calm, quiet resistance wasn't just defiance, it was dignity forged in fire. Across the street, Miles Carter, the gas station owner and Gulf War veteran, watched the scene boil over. Something didn't sit right. Walter wasn't confused, he was composed. Miles's instincts kicked in. He knew that kind of stillness. That wasn't senility, it was soldier's steel. Without hesitation, he called Fort Rainer, the nearby military base. I've got a situation, he told the duty officer. A fellow veteran, Colonel Walter Grant, is being disrespected by local police. He's not resisting, but he's being treated like a problem. He's not a problem, he's a national treasure. There was a pause on the line. Did you say Colonel Walter Grant? The voice suddenly sharpened. Hold the line. Moments later, we're dispatching a unit. Do not let them detain him. And do not let them touch him. We'll be there in 15. Miles hung up and stepped closer to the edge of the street. Heart pounding, eyes locked on the patrol scene unfolding. He didn't know exactly what was coming. But he knew this. The moment was about to change. And it did. The sound came first, a low, rising rumble, growing louder by the second. Then the dust appeared on the horizon, swirling like a storm cloud. 12 military Humvees tore around the bend, tires crunching over asphalt, moving in tight formation. They didn't slow until they reached the gas station, and then, without hesitation, they fanned out in a semicircle around the stunned officers and their cruiser. 50 soldiers stepped out. Not one of them spoke. Not one of them needed to. From the lead vehicle, a figure emerged. Captain Elijah Brooks, 55 years old. With 22 years of service in the Army and a presence that could quiet a battlefield. He didn't even glance at Monroe or Ramirez as he approached. Instead, he locked eyes with Walter Grant from a short distance and snapped a perfect salute. Colonel Grant. The word hit the air like a hammer. The gathered crowd went silent. Officer Monroe's face turned pale. Officer Ramirez looked like he'd swallowed a rock. No one moved. Brooks turned to them slowly. Voice now sharp as cold steel. Who, he demanded, dared to stop this man? Monroe stammered. We didn't know he was military. We just thought. You thought. Brooks cut her off. You thought you were detaining an old man. What you were doing was publicly humiliating a decorated war hero. This man served 3 tours in Vietnam. He led covert operations in the Gulf and Afghanistan. He holds 2 bronze stars, 2 Purple Hearts with 4 oak leaf clusters, and the Distinguished Service Cross. He trained me. He trained most of the men standing behind me. 50 soldiers took 1 synchronized step forward. He is a living legend in the United States Armed Forces. Brooks continued. And you treated him like a liability, when he's been the very backbone of everything this flag stands for. Silence. Even the wind had stopped. The onlookers, who moments ago were filming out of curiosity, now held their phones like relics. Capturing history. Their eyes, once skeptical, were now reverent. The weight of truth had fallen. And no one could deny it. Officer Monroe stepped back. Her voice cracked. Colonel Grant, I'm sorry. I didn't know. Walter finally spoke. Voice calm and level. That's the problem. Too many forget what they don't see. Brooks turned to him once more. Colonel, do you need transport? An escort? Walter shook his head with a faint smile. No, Captain. But thank you for showing up. The captain turned, and 50 soldiers formed a corridor of honor. Walter Grant mounted his Harley, started the engine, and rode straight through that corridor. His shoulders square, his legacy intact. Because sometimes, the cavalry doesn't come for a battle. Sometimes, it comes for respect. The day had started with authority. Officer Rachel Monroe was sure of herself, confident in her training, proud of her crisp uniform, and firm in her belief that rules were rules. When she stopped the elderly man on the motorcycle, she thought she was doing her job. She thought she was ensuring public safety. What she didn't realize was that she was standing in front of a living monument. Not a mistake to be corrected. But everything unraveled the moment Captain Elijah Brooks arrived with 50 soldiers, saluting the man she had just ordered into a patrol car. That man, Colonel Walter Grant, wasn't confused, delusional, or a danger to anyone. He was a national hero. And Rachel? She had just humiliated him in front of a growing crowd. Cameras rolling, unaware that her every word was being documented as a failure in judgment. In the days that followed, the video went viral, not for its drama, but for its quiet tragedy. Viewers across the country were moved by the sight of a proud old man holding his dignity while youth in uniform stripped it away. Veterans spoke up. Families cried. The police department was flooded with emails, phone calls, and pressure from the public. At the local precinct, Sheriff Thomas Beckett called for an emergency meeting. The message from the military base was crystal clear. There would be no lawsuit. No call for punishment, but there would be accountability. Colonel Grant isn't asking for heads to roll, Captain Brooks had told the sheriff. But the Army will not stand by while one of its most decorated veterans is treated like a threat in his hometown. So it began. A new training program, developed in partnership with the military base, was implemented. Every officer in the department, new and seasoned, was required to attend. When Rachel Monroe stood before her peers at that first session, the badge on her chest felt heavier than ever. I made a mistake, she began, voice trembling but sincere. I misjudged a man who deserved far better. I assumed things about him because of his age, his appearance, and his silence. I didn't ask questions. I didn't listen. And worst of all, I forgot the very oath we take, to protect and serve everyone with respect. She paused, then looked around the room. What I learned from Colonel Grant can't be found in a policy manual. It's about dignity. It's about recognizing that behind every face is a story. Behind every wrinkle might be a battlefield. And behind every quiet man might be a legacy you couldn't begin to imagine. Her colleagues were silent, not out of judgment, but because they felt the weight of her words. A few days later, Monroe drove down the winding back road of Highway 12, her heart pounding. She had asked the sheriff for permission to make one more visit, not as an officer, but as a student. She pulled up to a white farmhouse tucked beside a weathered barn. The grass was neatly trimmed. A rusted John Deere tractor rested nearby, and in the shade of an oak tree sat the unmistakable silhouette of that 1970 Harley-Davidson. She found Colonel Grant beneath the tractor, his hands covered in grease, working calmly. When she approached, he didn't flinch. He simply slid out, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked at her. "Officer Monroe," he said evenly. "Can I help you?" She swallowed. "I came to talk. If that's all right." Inside the kitchen, over mugs of black coffee, they spoke, not as cop and civilian, but as two Americans trying to understand one another. He asked her why she chose law enforcement. She told him about her desire to protect people, to serve her community. He nodded. Then he asked, "How many accidents caused by elderly riders have you responded to?" She paused. "Very few," she admitted. "Most of the wrecks I see are caused by younger drivers. Texting, drunk, reckless." He smiled gently. "Then why was I your target that day?" She looked down. That's when she understood. Respect isn't earned by age, or uniform, or even medals. It's earned by how we treat each other when no one's watching. And sometimes, the most powerful reform doesn't come from punishment. It comes from reflection. That day, Rachel Monroe didn't just apologize. She changed. And in doing so, she ensured that the next time her badge flashed in the sunlight, it would carry not just authority, but wisdom. Days after the storm had passed, Officer Rachel Monroe found herself once again on the quiet country road that led to Colonel Walter Grant's farmhouse. She wasn't there to enforce, interrogate, or apologize again. She was there to understand. She stepped out of her cruiser and approached the barn, where the colonel, dressed in grease-stained overalls, was working beneath a weathered John Deere tractor. The same rusted 1970 Harley-Davidson rested nearby, shaded beneath a tall oak. When he saw her, he didn't flinch or frown. He simply stood, wiped his hands on an old rag, and offered her a cup of coffee. In that modest kitchen, over 2 chipped ceramic mugs, they spoke, not of laws or mistakes, but of people, memories, and roads taken. When Monroe admitted her assumptions, that old meant fragile, that silence meant weakness, Grant said something she'd never forget. Respect isn't owed to the young or the old. It's owed to everyone, because what you see isn't always the whole story, and sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one who's carried the heaviest load. As Monroe looked out the window at the colonel's Harley, she realized something profound. That old bike had been running longer than she'd been alive. It still worked, still had miles left in it. Just like Walter Grant. Just like so many forgotten heroes around us. Never judge someone by how they look today, because you might be looking at someone who carried the world yesterday. We often forget that behind every wrinkle is a story. Behind every pause is strength. And behind every elder is a chapter we've yet to read. Let's not wait for salutes and sirens to remind us who deserves our respect. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. What does respect mean to you? And don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful true stories that reveal the heart behind the silence.